Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I think I have everything set where I want to, so I apologize. Trying to make sure where everything's at. I've been in meeting after meeting, so it's a little confusing sometimes when I have to move things around from one meeting to another, so I apologize for that. Well, hopefully everybody's doing well. Look at this camera for a minute. And hopefully you guys had a good week. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides real quickly, and then I'll probably come back to that in just a second. Okay, everybody sees full slides? Okay. So basically what we're going to be doing today is, as always, we'll do a little bit of check-in. I'll see if you guys have any questions. I do want to go over a couple little logistical things, draw your attention to a couple of issues, and then we will jump into talking about the Security Council. Obviously, as you probably are already seeing, we could teach an entire class on just Security Council. It's a very complex, very controversial, to say the least, and you're only getting sort of the tip of the iceberg. So I will say beforehand that I know that most of you, probably as you're reading it, may feel like you're not getting everything you wanted to out of a 16-week class. When it comes to that, okay. Where's my list? There we are. Okay. 3 windows, trying to keep track of things. And so if you ever have questions, more in-depth questions about anything we're covering in the class, always feel free to, don't hesitate to let me know. And of course, there's always a possibility that we will cover these more in-depth things than other classes. So for example, we will be talking about the UN Security Council when I teach my Intro to Global System, or Issues in the Global System class in the spring, which is a class that our global studies majors take, but it is open to other students. And so some of these are covered in other classes, but obviously if you're really interested, there's always a possibility of I can give you additional readings outside of the class that you might find interesting. And of course, there's always independent studies. That's what independent studies, or for my graduate students, directed studies, that's what those are for, is so that you can theoretically, at least in most departments, at least that's how we treat it, my department, is go more in depth into an actual issue and talk more about that, okay? And then, of course, at the end, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about sort of questions to be thinking about as we move forward with the rest of this week. I can't believe it's already Wednesday, by the way. It felt like Monday and Tuesday blew by. I don't know how you feel. And today I woke up and next thing I know, class was 5 minutes ago. So let's talk about, see how everybody's doing, checking in with everybody, see how everybody's doing. First and foremost, how's everybody doing mentally, emotionally? I know I feel like I'm your weekly psychologist, but that's part of my job too. Anybody want to share anything or anything interesting for the good of the group? Exhausted. I agree with Stefan. I feel you on that one. Online learning, I know a lot of people. How many of you guys have ever taken, just by show of hands on your camera, for those of you who have your camera on, or if you know how to click the hand up thing on the other, you can do that too. How many of you guys have taken online class? I mean, I'm not including the craziness of switching to virtual in the spring. How many of you guys have taken online classes before? Okay, so a few of you guys. Okay, but not a lot, right? I taught online classes at Victor Valley College for 7 years. Well, I'm sorry. I taught there for 7 years. The last 2.5 years I taught online while I was teaching, because I was teaching at UCR, living in Riverside, and still teaching Victor Valley College as well at the same time. And it just got too much for me to drive back and forth from Riverside to the high desert. So I started teaching online. And that was in early 2000s. That's before all the technology we have now. Zoom wasn't around, and all that stuff. And I know I was exhausted then. I will tell you, I've talked to faculty, as a department chair, I have 12 faculty that I manage, and we're just exhausted as all of you. So, couple things I can say is be good to yourself first and foremost. And of course, be good to your faculty, please. I don't necessarily mean me, I can take it, I'm used to it. But, it's one of the things I think we tend to forget is that none of us who do this for a living were ever trained to do this, as you guys were never really trained on how to do virtual classes for the most part. So we are doing the best we can, and I hope we're doing a good job. I hope you're enjoying the class. I feel like we never have enough time to cover everything I want to cover in the class. We could talk for hours, I'm sure, many of you, but the this is the problem with the semester system, right? Shorter class periods. So if you need anything at any time, one of the things I've said before, and I truly do mean that, and it's not because, one of the things I tell students is I'm a tenured senior faculty member. What I tell you, I don't have to tell you because I need to keep my job. I have a job, a pretty secure one, but it's because I really want to serve you guys as best as possible. So don't ever hesitate to email me, call me on my office phone. My office phone doesn't go directly to my phone like it does with our ASC, but you can leave a message and I will get back to you, because as soon as you leave a message there, it sends me a WAV file in my email, and then I will respond. And I do try to respond to you guys as quickly as possible. Usually, actually, you guys get responses quicker than almost anybody else. I try to put you as priority number one when I see your emails. If you do email me about something, I don't get back to you, that probably means I didn't get your email if you don't get a response in 24 hours. The only exception would be is generally I don't respond to any things over the weekend unless it's an emergency. One of the things that I would recommend to all of you, as I'm having to try to train myself to do, is find time for yourselves. And so my weekends are for my family and I. I figure my kids are in school all week long in the mornings online. I sit actually next to one while I'm grading your guys' stuff while she's doing kindergarten online, which is fascinating all to itself, by the way. Power to K through 12 teachers, because let me tell you, my job is way easier than your guys. But yeah, feel free to do that. And do I, any tips or anything on maintaining happiness and wellness? When I work that out, I will let you know. There are things I will post for you. I mean, one of the things that we do get information, there is all this support, by the way, that you're all probably sort of aware of. I try to redirect information to you when I get it. And I definitely do it to our department, all of our majors. Because we know about the mental impact, emotional impact that this sort of more isolated environment has, we are really trying to ramp up a lot of those resources. So you'll probably notice, like I'm hoping some of you use the Tools for Wellness button that I put on Blackboard and some of those things, as well as in the playlist for our class where I post videos and stuff for our class. I've tried to post videos and other stuff in there. If there's things that you want to share with your colleagues and you think it's good and it'll help the class, always feel free to send it to me. I'll send it to the entire class. Obviously, I'll vet it beforehand, but I don't mind to do that. We're all in this together, and that's kind of the way to think about it. You'll never forget these years of your college this year. Hopefully it's just this year, by the way, we hope. And I'm sure, as all of you know, we are going to be virtual again in the spring, with probably a handful of classes still being taught. For those of you taking classes with me in my department, all of our classes will be virtual in the Geography and Environmental Studies department, without a doubt. We're redoing the schedule right now. I think probably the only classes that will most likely be approved for face-to-face or for some hybrid is if you're a nursing student. I think some fine arts classes possibly, probably similar to what we saw this fall. So there won't be a lot. So pack up your bags and go to Jamaica. No. But the key is that, we're going to be like this through the fall. I hope you also saw the announcement about fall commencement for those of you that are graduating or have friends or family that are graduating in what would normally be we used to call it winter commencement. We're calling it fall commencement, which probably makes more sense because it's not actually in winter. But that is going to be virtual. They just announced yesterday. And then there'll be a makeup commencement, I'm assuming, both for last year's class as well as those of you maybe who are graduating in December, or at least those who have friends or family that are. Let's just hope we're back for a real commencement come May. That's what we're hoping for. Okay. Questions. Karen asked if we're going to offer any courses for winter intersession. I'm not. I've been told I'm not allowed to teach over the winter intersession because there is a higher power than I. It's called my wife. But it's also a way for me to take a break. There will definitely be some course offerings. So reach out to your departments and make sure that you ask your departments. It will vary by department. I know we will be offering some in my department. So if you're interested in any geography courses, let me know. I can let you know what courses there'll be. But it'll be a very small group. I think with most of us, I think the plan was there was going to be winter intersession this year was going to be mostly study abroad, but obviously study abroad's out right now because what's going on. So feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about my department or just need help getting in contact with other people from your department as well. Okay. And there might be some better offerings by others in GE. Look, definitely if you're looking for GE classes, definitely look in winter intersession. Here's the bad news. And that is my understanding, at least in the meeting I was in yesterday, is that summer session is not covered by financial aid. Not summer session, sorry, winter intersession. Sorry, I keep getting those mixed up.
No, it's not. They're asking that you reserve your fall financial aid to take classes in the winter. I think they sent the email a little bit too late, though.
Karen works for the college who runs all these things. She does not personally, so don't bother her with your questions. But
I did initially, but I was kicked off winter intersession. The course offerings just haven't come out yet, so that's why I was asking you, because I didn't get in on that meeting. But I was just asking if
yeah, they're supposed to come out, I believe, 1st of October or in the next few days. It's in the next few days, is my understanding. Yeah. Okay. As you guys know, of course, the UN is in general debate week. Has anybody followed? I'm guessing based on some of the comments you guys are making in the chat, some of you guys have seen the rhetoric, needless to say, go up. Ruben, you were saying, I think something about it.
Yeah, I was saying that I didn't get a chance to type it. I was just gonna share with the class since we were kind of going over that. I was watching how when Trump was giving his address to the General Assembly, and I thought it was like kind of funny in a sense, how, or like sort of unprofessional, how he was talking about the coronavirus epidemic and calling it the Chinese virus. And it showed, and the camera points to the Chinese ambassador, and he's kind of just sitting there like, in my mind, he's probably thinking like, what are you talking about, man? Like, why are you pointing everything at us? So I was kind of thinking like, what was he trying to say basically? What's the main issue that Trump is trying to put, and what solution is he trying to, get at, if you know what I mean?
No, it's a good. So one of the things we didn't talk about last week, and I was hoping, and as always, world leaders are always useful for teaching in my class. So this is a great teaching moment. What diplomats say at the UN is often very, very different than what you hear during this general debate week. General debate week, most of the people who you're going to hear either are prime minister, foreign ministers, kings, amirs in the case of the UAE, which is just Arabic for prince, or basically they're the leaders of the country. They're not the normal diplomats. So a lot of what you're actually hearing right now, and this is not just exclusive to Trump, by the way, this is usually across the board, is they are speaking to a domestic audience back home. They're not actually speaking to trying to convince and win hearts and minds at the United Nations. And that was true even without COVID, by the way. And so when you look at sort of rhetoric that is used by policymakers, it is very, very different. One of the weapons of diplomats, as I said a couple weeks ago, and maybe even last week, is the use of words. That's why a lot of diplomats through many different countries tend to have law degrees or law backgrounds, because it's about parsing of words. And so most likely, and I'm not going to speak for President Trump, and I'm apolitical as a professor, at least in this context of this classroom, but I will tell you that most likely he is, particularly because it's an election year, he's speaking to a constituency back in the United States with that speech. He's not trying to convince anybody at the United Nations. Just as when Hugo Chavez, the former leader of Venezuela, would get up and the very famous speech he gave, some of you guys probably remember, he walked up and said, "I smell sulfur in this room," because what he was insinuating is that the U.S. and their allies are there, and that's the devil. And he actually said that. That's not diplomacy. I mean, ultimately, what that is, that's politics. And so, what they're trying to do is use this world stage to really say to the rest, to their constituencies, in this space, I'm telling you what our administration, our regime, whatever term you want to use, what their position is on these issues. And that's why, like, you'll hear some of the most eloquent speeches ever given during General Debate Week. You'll also hear some of the most amazing craziness ever. And that goes around the world, by the way. There are very few countries who don't, during General Debate Week, have their heads of state speaking. The exceptions would probably be like a lot of the South Pacific islands, ones who don't have a lot of resources. So they're like, why am I going to? Now, this year, I think that's going to be a lot different. I've been talking to colleagues of mine who work at the United Nations who are there right now in the midst of all of General Debate Week. And they think there's going to be a lot more heads of state speaking this week, mostly because most of it's being done virtually. So there's nothing that can say that the leader of Palau can't just turn on Zoom, or it's not Zoom, but their version of Zoom, and speak before the UN body. So what's going to be interesting is you guys are taking this class at a time where we might actually hear more of the world speaking about current global issues or whatever their positions are on things. But just always remember, that's not diplomacy. That's not what diplomats do. And so when you do hear people kind of using rhetoric and using language, just remember that they're speaking to a constituency wherever they are coming from. They're not speaking to actual diplomats. The language is vastly different.
Oh, I had a quick question. Since there's ambassadors and diplomats to the UN, could the leader of like any country like the US or China, could they like step in for like that ambassador to like the Security Council or the General Assembly, if you know what I mean? If
Yes.
if they wanted to.
Yes. So yeah, we'll put it, because unless other people have other questions, let me talk about that in the context of Security Council, because I think it's a really, really good question. That's why you'll see pictures of Justin Trudeau or President Trump or President Obama or President W before him would be speaking in the Security Council. It's because technically, if they're that whoever that designated representative is that's recognized by the United Nations, they are allowed to speak. Now, what often will happen is the ambassador who's assigned to the Security Council will defer they'll basically yield their speaking rights over to whoever that is. So, for example, former U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley, who was our U.S. Ambassador to the UN until just very recently under the Trump administration, she routinely spoke in front of the UN Security Council. Realistically, previous administrations, the ambassador to of the U.S. to the UN wouldn't necessarily always hold that seat. It would just be a lower-ranking ambassador at the U.S. mission. So it really varies on like what's going on globally, what the issue is. Also, it's a little bit of politics, right? Is, hey, let me show my face up because this is what's going on in my country. It's important to us. Usually the only time you'll see like the ambassador of a U.S. mission speaking in Security Council would be is like if somebody's invited. So for example, the State of Palestine's observer mission is routinely invited to come and speak in the Security Council when it's an issue concerning the Middle East and the issue of Palestine and Israel. And if they're allowed to actually come in, they don't have a vote. They don't have anything else. They have speaking rights basically. And so if they're allowed to come in, usually it is that ambassador who runs that mission. It's not some lower ranking ambassador. But when it comes to the actual membership, it varies. But yeah, they could definitely do that. Okay, a couple other things. Very good questions. So see, as I told you, there's a lot to talk about Security Council. So, and also this time of the year, this is like basketball season. This is like the Final Four from UN. Is this time of the year is when it's very busy in New York. Usually, if COVID wasn't going on. Somebody had said something else. No,
it's Shark Week for politics.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, for sure. I've had the UN stuff on in the background when I've been working since General Debate Week started, just so I could hear the speeches, mostly for you guys. So if something came up. And yeah, I've heard a lot of really interesting speeches already this week. It's been fascinating. And my friend who works at the UN is actually in the chamber, so she'll send me a message occasionally like, hey, guess what? This person's getting up. You got to hear this person speak. Of course, it was a lot better when they were in person doing that. So a couple other logistical things, and we're going to move on to talk about specifically Security Council tonight. We won't get through all of it tonight, but I will post some additional micro lectures, in particular with the Security Council, because there's so much stuff we could cover that we just won't have enough time, even over 2 sessions in one module for it. Number one was, of course, your Think, Pair, Share. You guys all know you had until noon today because I wasn't able to post it earlier. What I will do from this point onward is that unless something happens like I did last weekend, is I'll actually open up the Think, Pair, Shares on Saturday morning. So that gives you basically Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday to work on them. The reason is because some of you have emailed me individually, and I appreciate it, saying, hey, my teammates aren't responding, or hey, I wasn't able to get to this because I'm working like a 12-hour shift. And I know everybody's, swamped with work and life is just crazy right now. So I'm going to try to extend that time. So I'll send you those times out and say this will be the point. But you can just bet on, not this week, of course, but the following week for Module 4, Think Pair Shares from this point on were to open on Saturday instead of Monday. So that way you have more time to work on them. With that being said, if you have a situation where because of your schedule, the way it is, you just can't reply to people because your team members are waiting to the last minute, first I would ask that the team members, at least one person, post. I'm giving you guys a long period of time. Don't wait to the end to do it. But also if that happens, feel free to email me. That's what I said in the email I sent out to you. Because at least if I know something's going on, I can work with you. If I don't know what's going on, then that's a bigger problem. Okay. And I'm always willing to work with students. What I don't want, and this is to be very blunt, is for you to show up like week, what used to be 10. So now week 15, I guess, or 14, and say, oh, I meant to tell you about these things. Because at that point, I'm probably going to be like, well, I don't know whether to trust you or not because you waited all these weeks to tell me. Okay. So when something comes up, just send me a quick email. If I don't get right back to you, that's okay. But I will get back to you on those issues and try to give you some sort of solution. So for those of you that are, I know, stressing out, and everybody's in a very stressful environment right now, understand I'll work with you. I guess that's the key thing here. Don't feel like you're out there all alone. Okay. So just feel free to drop me an email and I'll get back to you as quick as possible. Couple other little logistical things, and I'll mention these again at the end of class today as well. Is we're in course week 5. God, we're in week 5. We would be halfway through the class right now if this was quarters, but that's a different issue. So we're in module 3 of this week. We'll have module 4. And remember that module 4 is going to be kind of a quonky one because module 4, we will basically start off like we always do. We'll have the live virtual session, the online prep quiz. That following Wednesday, though, remember, we will not have a live virtual session. That's in the syllabus. It's on, what date is that? Let me look real quickly and tell you. And I'll send an announcement about this out as well so you guys can write it down in your notes. But so on October, which is just right around the corner now, October, where are you at? Nope, that's not right. Yeah, 12th through 18th. I believe it's the 14th. I'll double check, but I believe it's October 14th. We will not have a live virtual session. It'll be the only time, barring me being sick or something, doing that. There'll be there will be a live session, but it won't be like this. It'll just be an optional session. So there will be a class, the 14th, I believe it is, but I'll double check it for you. That if you want to come and you just want to ask questions about what we've covered the first half of class, it's basically a study session with me. And so instead of us covering new material that week, what we will do instead is on that session, we'll do it. And of course, October 15th through 18th, you'll be taking a closed book, closed note midterm exam. And we'll talk more about that next week. And I will post actually a study guide for that probably by the end of next week. Because I already know kind of what we're going to be covering in the next module. So that way you can start. I know you guys have been working in study groups. The thing I always tell students, you guys are horrible at keeping secrets. So of course I know there's group me's and all sorts of stuff. And so the reality is that I think that's great. If you guys work together, study together, right? Especially in this environment, try to find a friend, I guess, is the key here. And somebody who's going through this class is definitely a buddy at this point. So but we'll talk more about the midterm next week. The midterm, remember, we'll cover all the material from the first day of class all the way through what we cover as of next Wednesday. Is it next Wednesday? I think it's next Wednesday or Wednesday after. Okay. We'll talk more about it. Not next Wednesday after that. Okay. But it is coming up to the midterms pretty quickly. So I just want to kind of draw your attention to that. If you didn't get my email, yeah, there'll be a study guide. If you didn't get my email, remember real life application exercise number 2. You did not have to do, everybody will get credit for that. I'm going to give you feedback. I've been updating the grade book with grades, and then I'm going back and putting in, if you completed the assignment, the real life application exercise, you're going to get full credit on that. You're going to get 100%. But I do want to give you detailed feedback, so it's taking me a little bit longer to go through and type everybody's comments. But you'll have that before we get into next week. Okay, probably have it in the next 2 days. Please definitely pay attention, because I'm taking a lot of time to go through and kind of tell you, here's the stuff I would recommend you keep in mind as you do what will become real life application exercise number 3 for this module, which will be next week. Okay? Questions? A lot of logistics, but it's good that we get through it. I think I answered that question. Okay, so, oops. So let's talk about the Security Council, and what I used to refer to as the strong arm of the law of the UN. So, we talked about the UN General Assembly last week. We talked about the fact that the UN General Assembly doesn't really create laws. I mean, there's some ambiguity about that. We talked about the fact that if a large percentage of the world belongs to the UN and a lot of things pass by consensus, could that be considered a norm? But with the UN Security Council, it is mandated in the charter that anything that the UN Security Council calls upon countries to do, they are actually they're supposed to do it because they are a member of the United Nations. Okay, so unlike the UN General Assembly, where the UN General Assembly is a lot more, the UN General Assembly is a recommender, is the way to think about it. The Security Council is basically the enforcer. It's kind of sort of a way to think about it. So let's talk a little bit about what the Security Council is. So Chapter 5, Article 24 of the UN Charter is very clear. It gives the UN Security Council basically responsibility to look over, and the term they use is, quote, maintenance of international peace and security. Remember that the UN was created in the aftermath of the World War II. And actually, after 2 consecutive world wars, you have this international body that was created. And the first priority, ultimately, by the way, of the UN in 1945 was let's not allow this to happen again. Okay, that was really what it was focusing on. The UN does much more than that today, obviously, right? But that primary mission, one of the very first things the drafters of the UN Charter worked on is what we're studying this week, the UN Security Council. Because what they didn't want, they wanted to have a place where people could come together, have a space to discuss issues so it wouldn't go to war with each other. But at the same time, they were also very realistic that at times there's going to be conflict. So how do you create an international cooperative body that can solve this very wicked problem of conflict? And of course, little did we know that we were going to be smack dab in the middle of a Cold War right after the UN was founded. That we would have subsequent major wars and genocides throughout the world. That's not something I think any of the drafters would have ever thought we'd do. So there's really 2 major powers the UN Security Council has, is the way to kind of think about it. And this is basically what I would consider binding and non-binding. Okay, so binding means basically under international law, under the UN Charter, if you're a member, you're bound by whatever the Security Council says. Non-binding basically means it's going to be like a recommendation. So the UN Security Council does do recommendations. They do stuff that is basically less law and less of a strong arm. Okay, so they are involved in both. But I think most people, when they think of basically this UN Security Council, they almost exclusively focus on the peacekeeping operations, the authorization of warfare, those kind of things. But I don't want you to forget that, in fact, the very first chapter of the UN Charter, that section, actually says the UN Security Council is responsible for what we call Pacific settlement. Can somebody tell me what that might mean? Pacific settlement. Anybody? Nobody tonight wants to take a guess?
My assumption, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Ladies first.
Go ahead, Heather.
So Pacific, I would think it would be relating to like the Pacific area, like globally talking about, and maybe.
No, and that's why, not quite, no. So Pacific in this context, and that's why I wanted to bring up, so that if you saw it in the slides or in the readings, you were like, or in the UN Charter, you're like, wait a minute, that it's not a word you actually see or we use much often anymore, to be honest with you. It actually comes from the same term as pacifism. It's the idea of basically solving conflict. Post-Pacific settlement under Chapter 6 is how do you stop conflict when you have two UN member states who go to war with each other, okay, or attack each other or invade each other, right? That's against international law after 1945. How do you then stop them from continuing to do that? So let me give you an example from the 1980s. So Argentina has a set of islands off the coast of it. It's called the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands are actually not part of Argentina, according to the British government. It is considered a British, basically a British entity, a colony. Okay, and this goes back history. I'm not going to give you all the history of it there, but it has a lot to do with the history and colonialism in Latin America. In the 1980s, war broke out on that island because you had people who were Falklanders, people who lived there, who said, we don't want to be part of the British Empire. We are akin to, we want to have our own autonomy. We would actually like to be more aligned with Argentina because that's who culturally we're more associated with, and not the British, right? And so what happened was a major war broke out on the island. The British got involved, right? The U.S., of course, got involved because its proximity to us is pretty close geographically. I mean, not that close, but it's closer than other places. Plus, the UK is an ally. And Argentina, we, of course, had a trade relationship with. So what happened was the UN and the Organization of American States, another international body, got together and said, okay, we have to act as we have to really create some sort of settlement to this conflict so people aren't dying. Okay, and so there's many different instances from 45 till today of that happening. But the Security Council very often will act as, and a term I used last week, I told you to get to this week, and that is a good office. One of my favorite terms in diplomacy. And what a good office is ultimately it's this idea that you have two warring parties. The way to get them to settle their conflict in a peaceful way is through mediation. But mediation means you have to have an outside body that has no vested interest. Okay. So, for example, let's say United States and Mexico decide tomorrow to go to war with each other. Okay. Not saying that's what's going to happen. It's not like I know something. Just let's say that's happened. If they decide to happen, then would you want to bring in Canada into that? Would they be a good mediator? No, because there's a vested interest. They share a border with the United States. They're in a trade relationship with the two warring parties. But instead, what you could do is you could go to the UN Security Council and ask for them to mediate the conflict. And that's what's really one of the biggest things that is often not covered that the Security Council has dealt with many times throughout its history, is this idea of acting as a good office. By the way, non-UN related entities also act as a good office. Sometimes countries do. So one of the best examples of this is, and this is where I'm going to date myself how old I am. If you go back to 1980, I remember vividly every night turning on the news as a early teen and turning on the news, and what you would see is the Iranian hostage crisis. This is in 78, 79, you have the Iranian Revolution. Eventually, what will happen is the U.S. Embassy in Iran, because we did have a U.S. Embassy there for many years and relationships prior to the Islamic Revolution. What happened was the U.S. Embassy was overthrown. There was hostages taken. They were held for 444 days. A lot of people go, oh, and you probably have seen like, all sorts of movies and stuff that talk about this time period. What often is left out of that discussion is actually it was the Algerians, right? Algeria, a country in North Africa, that acted as a good office, a third intermediated party between the United States and basically those who had taken over what is now called the Islamic Republic of Iran, those that overthrew the previous regime. And so what you end up with basically the Algerians and also the Swiss acting as a good office trying to mediate the release of these hostages. By the way, it's almost never covered in any sort of media accounts. You almost have to look in conflict resolution literature to find this idea of good office and these people acting. But it's happened many times throughout history. Sometimes it's an individual. It's not just a country. But in the case of the UN, the Security Council, that is one of their big jobs listed in the charter and is not binding, right? It's not like they say, you agree not to attack that person. That's not a binding resolution. It's just you acting as a good office. Now, what the UN is really known for is the binding powers, right? And that's why I think a lot of people are really excited when we get to talk about the Security Council, because they are the ones that they can authorize the use of force, and they can authorize the use of sanctions under what's called Chapter 7 operations. Chapter 7 is just that part of the UN Charter that allows them to do that. If they are actually using force, the Military Staff Committee, we'll talk about in a couple minutes, actually helps direct that military force. Now, with that being said, this picture you see here, most people, I've seen this actually on a website not too long ago of kind of some of the extremists I study, and they're like, look, one world government, this is the UN troops. And I'm like, you do realize, first of all, that's a Korean picture. Those are actually peacekeepers from Korea. The UN does not have its own army. What they do is they draw from, we're going to talk more about that on next Wednesday, but they draw basically peacekeeping operation forces from the member states that make it up. And we'll talk more about that in depth next week. But they can also authorize the use of sanctions. And in fact, more often than the use of force, the UN Security Council most often uses the power of sanctions. And they can sanction travel, they can sanction money, they can do all sorts of things. So for example, you guys have probably been listening to, hopefully, the news this last week. What is the United States calling for right now against Iran?
Sanctions.
Sanctions. So there was a statement made by President Trump, no matter how you feel about him. I'm just stating the facts here, that he made a statement, and so did somebody else in the U.S. State Department, that was actually erroneous. Because what they said was, they said, we're going to authorize sanctions regardless if the UN passes them. Okay, that's not how the UN works, and that's not how the Security Council works. Because if the U.S. wants to apply more sanctions against Iran or any other country, they have to use the voting procedure in the Security Council. They can't just do it arbitrarily. Now, can the United States, through bilateral action, apply their own sanctions? Yes. And in fact, we've had sanctions on Iran since 1979. So that's nothing new. Those have not really wavered very much over the years. There have been sanctions on various levels for some time. A great example of this is when Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, the very one who was very fiery in his language at the UN during General Debate Week, when he would come to New York City, because of diplomatic immunity, because he's the head of a state and he was invited by the UN to come and speak, we couldn't prevent him from entering the country. What you could do, though, and there were sanctions against Iran, is that he was only allowed to go in certain blocks in New York City. That's the only place he was allowed to go in the entire United States during his time here. Basically, he was allowed to get off the plane at JFK or LaGuardia, go down this one street, maybe go to a couple delis around the Mission, and that was the extent of it. He was very, very limited because the United Nations itself is not actually part of the United States. That's the other thing you're going to hear a lot about this week. I already heard a couple policymakers say, we're going to kick the UN out of the US. Well, first of all, you can't do that. We don't own that property. The UN owns it. Even if the US tomorrow withdrew from the United Nations could still stay in New York City where it's at. John D. Rockefeller sold them the land that it's on. And so they actually own that, and under international law, it's international territory. So, for example, they have their own police force, they have their own fire department. Basically, now they work with, obviously, fire department in New York City and with NYPD if there's issues. Yeah, Ruben.
I guess you can say that that's their sovereignty.
It is. Yeah, it's a good point. The international organizations argue we have sovereignty just like everybody else does. So one of the things I tell my Model UN students is, if you commit a crime while we're at the UN, one, I'm not going to do anything for you. One, I'm not an attorney. But also, you've just committed a crime in international territory. I'm not even sure how they deal with that. So, my students are very terrified by that. So usually that's a good thing. But yeah, so the point is, let me go back to Security Council, is there isn't a one, this use of force is there. It's not often used as often as you think it is. Sanctions, as you read in the book this week, by Linda's book, is used way more often. And sanctions can be devastating. Sanctions have definitely crippled countries that have been applied by the UN Security Council. At its height, there was an estimated about 1,500 Iraqi children dying per day in Iraq. This is during Saddam Hussein being in power, before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it was because of sanctions. You couldn't sell Iraq pencils. I'm not making this all up. You can look it all up. You could not sell Iraq. There's a prohibited list of what things could be sold to Iraq. Pencils were one of them. Does anybody know why? Why pencils?
Of lead in them?
Not lead, but you're close. Graphite. And what can you use for graphite? Graphite can be used for centrifuge construction and the use of creating fissile material, meaning nuclear material, basically. Now, mind you, you have to have a lot of pencils to get to that point. They also were only allowed to buy the parts. They had one ambulance at one point for the entire country, one functioning ambulance. And by the way, Iraq is about half the size of the state of California. It's a big country. But sanctions were applied because of, obviously, the actions that had pre-existed before that, right? With Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and a variety of other things he did after that. Okay? Oops, sorry. So how does it actually work? Now, I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts. It is way more complicated than this. One of the countries the country we're asking to represent at National Model UN this year is Mexico. We'll have 30 seats, and just by coincidence, Mexico is serving on the UN Security Council now for the next 2 years. And so whoever, if one of you guys apply, there is a possibility you may actually be representing Mexico in that model competition through UN. It's really fascinating. So you'll learn more in depth. But if you're interested, I can send you guys more detailed information, but this is just stuff I want you to know for the class. So basically the way the UN Security Council works, and this is the UN Security Council chamber here you see in the top photo, is basically there's a provisional agenda drawn up every year by the Secretary General. It's approved by the Security Council President. And basically that is their tentative, and that's why I say provisional, is their tentative agenda of issues they're going to address. Now, remember that they can change that agenda at any time given what's happening in the world. So let's say they're talking about, like, one of the topics that comes up every year that might be of interest to all of you, but particularly the women in the class, is there's actually a discussion every year for the last 5-6 years now of women in conflict and like the impact of them as victims, but also as soldiers and a variety of other things. And so that's on the agenda every year. But what if all of a sudden there's an invasion? COVID-19 breaks out, right? These are all issues that Security Council will deal with because there's peace and security implications to it. So that means that provisional agenda is literally very tentative. It's very provisional. With that being said, we should remember that even though the Secretary General draws up the agenda and it's approved by the Security Council President, that presidency rotates alphabetically every month. So it could be a different person each time who's making that final determination. And in fact, for this month, I looked it up for class for you, the current Security Council President is the ambassador from Niger, which is a country in North Africa. They're one of the 3 African representatives on the council. Now, unlike the UN Security General Assembly, very important here to note, the UN General Assembly, remember, meets for only a certain period of the year, right? We talked about the last couple weeks. Security Council meets year-round because they're dealing with stuff that literally can develop in a matter of minutes or seconds. So if you are the ambassador for the U.S. mission to the UN and your job is to sit on the Security Council, guess where you live? Right down the street from the UN. You literally are on call 24 hours a day while you're at that post. And that's true for all the people who sit on that council. Because, in fact, a lot of them have there's actually an apartment complex where a lot of diplomats live right down the street from the UN. You can walk. It's literally a block or less. And so a lot of them actually live there because they can, or at least have an apartment there. It's not maybe their permanent residence. Because that way they can just go straight down the elevator, straight to work. And they may work for 24 or more hours straight, depending on what's going on globally. So when you see major conflict break out, there are people there working on it, and they're staff people. Okay. They do meet, of course, as I say here, anytime the president basically calls them into session. More importantly, let's say if the world's very peaceful, which doesn't happen very often, but let's say it does, basically there will never be any time period where it'll be less than 14 days between meetings. So they're meeting all the time, even if the world was great and peaceful and everything else. There can be a request by the Secretary General or by UN member states to also meet. And usually if that's the case, then they will try to have a meeting within 24 hours. Mostly why they say 24 hours, because it gives them time for their staff to get all the relevant information. So that way you're not kind of having these meetings. They do have closed meetings and open meetings. The open meetings are broadcast on the United Nations UN Web TV channel. So if you're interested, you can watch those sessions. Closed sessions tend to be very rare, but they tend to be things like voting on ICJ justices, voting on, basically any power related to sort of credentialing of individuals to become parts of the United Nations, because you don't want that to be interfered with. There are a handful of closed meetings that have occurred due to conflict, and that has to do with maybe that there were more global implications, that you wanted the diplomats in that room feel not be pressured by the 24-hour news cycle. Okay.
Was the JCPOA one of those ones that wasn't televised?
It was not televised. Yeah. They do
Okay.
keep records though. They keep records of the closed meetings as well. Yeah. Okay. Any questions so far? So I don't need you to know the current membership, except for you do need to know who are the P5. That is something you absolutely, I won't ask you to know a lot of names or countries in this class, but this you do need to know because it's really important to understand the Security Council. So the P5, remember, as you probably read this week, are the permanent 5. These are the ones that have the veto power. Basically, these are the founders of the United Nations plus 2 that asked to join, who were there pretty much from the beginning. They're 2 of the founders as well of the United Nations. They just weren't necessarily people who drafted anything. And of course, that's the United States, the UK, United Kingdom, Russian Federation, which of course previously was the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, we'll come back to that in a minute, and France. Okay. But remember, you also have in addition 10 non-permanent members that serve a 2-year period in that seat. So you'll see here what I've done is I've listed all of the ones that are currently serving or will be serving. And so like Mexico will come in this year, even though they're not on the list right now, they're coming in this year. And so what you'll actually find is this here are the non-permanent members, and they're voted on basically by their regional blocks. So remember how I told you the last couple of weeks, voting blocks are really important at the UN? This is where that plays a role again, because what will happen, let me go back to this here, is you'll see in this lower diagram on your slides that this 10 seats, or the ones that are shown in green, these are the non-permanent, or the E10 as they call them sometimes. 3 seats are given to Africa, okay? 2 to Latin America, 1 to Asia. And so you'll see the seats broken up here. But the African countries all have to get together and say, okay, who do we want to vote in as our members? Now, each of these groups does it differently. Most notably in the readings, I do want you to really know this. Africa is kind of unique. What they do is they tend to rotate every country that belongs to that group through being a Security Council member. Because the belief is they want everybody to have served on the Security Council at some point. Is that true for Eastern Europe, Western Europe, or Latin America? No. Generally, it's a voting process. In the case of Asia, by the way, this also includes Arab states, by the way. So there's only one time. So if you're voted in, generally it's because you've run for that election in your little block and they've put you up, and then you're approved by the Security Council, by the General Assembly, sorry, to be a UN Security Council non-permanent member. With that being said, please put a note right here, because it's not in your slides, but I do want you to write this down. There's only been one time in UN history where somebody who was voted in by their bloc to be, and was voted in by the General Assembly to sit as a representative, declined their seat. Meaning they just said, nope, we're good. We don't want to be on the Security Council. Does anybody know who that is?
Was it Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia. Yeah, Saudi Arabia. What they did was in, I believe it was 2013, if I remember correctly, is they decided they would not take their seat, and it was political. What they said is basically is that the Security Council was ineffectual at solving the crisis in Syria and in the greater Middle East, and they would not be a part of this dysfunctional organization. So they basically gave up their seat. And in that particular case, the country of Jordan, or in the UN, they're called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, is their full long name, basically became that the next person who was voted in and took that seat. So remember that even though there's these utopian goals, there's also politics involved here a lot of times too, as we've been talking about. And I can tell you because right after they declined that, we were in New York City and the Saudi ambassador to the UN spoke at the conference that year. And that was the first time that they had announced outside the UN that they were not going to take the seat. And he was not abashed at all about why they were going to do it. He basically bashed on the United Nations, which was ironic because in this largest model United Nations conference in the world, and you're the keynote speaker, you're bashing on the organization. But, go figure, politics. Okay? Questions? Good? Okay. So, really important for us to take away from today is the power of veto. So remember that I said that I don't need you to know the E10 because at first it changes every 2 years. But the P5 are important because these are the same 5 members who've been there since the beginning of the United Nations in 1945. When a resolution, right, these are the things that are going to call for action that become under the Security Council or actual law, right, because they enforce things. Unlike the Security, UN General Assembly, whereas recommendations, the things that are being passed in the Security Council resolutions are actually considered international law. And there are mandates for the UN members to do. Is for a resolution to pass, all P5 members have to vote in favor or abstain. Abstain basically means I'm not going to get involved in, I'm not going to vote yes, I'm not going to vote no, I'm voting, but I'm just going to stay out of the fight. Okay? And it's all, by the way, these are 15 members in a round chamber. That's why I keep showing you the chamber. This is an actual vote you'll see here. This actually was a vote on the use or sanctions against Syria, I believe it was. And so it is all done by hand vote. There's no electronic. You don't get to hide behind your vote. Everybody knows how you vote. So you can imagine how intimidating is that? That'd be like if right now, we were in class and I said, okay, all of you are going to vote. And I'm going to give 5 of you veto. So if everybody else agrees, and we're all do by hand vote of whether or not you get 5 extra points, there's a lot of pressure there, right? This is going to have implications for people's lives, livelihoods, a variety of things. These just single votes by hands. So a couple of things I should remind you about, right? So that's just the general thing, is that if any P5 member votes no, it automatically the resolution fails. So you can have 14 for a resolution, 0 abstentions, and 1 member vote against it. And if one of those members is one of the P5, it fails. Okay.
Are there any current proposals to get rid of that power of veto?
Ask me that in just a second because I'm going to come back to that. That's a really good question. That's a very good question, actually. The short answer is yes, there's a desire to do it, but guess who gets to vote on, who has to vote on any amendments to the UN Charter? Where does it start?
P5.
Yeah. So guess what? I mean, it would be like if I said, okay, you get to determine how much you get paid. Are you going to be willing to be like, yeah, sure, I'll give up some money. I'm perfectly fine. No, of course not, right? There's self-interest. Countries are self-interest. So there has been very little movement on wanting to revise the UN Security Council on the veto vote, mostly because you have to get all 5 members to agree. And nobody's willing to do that.
Yeah,
now, there are some that are better than others.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Karen.
Watching the video, in the past 2 years, they've been at a deadlock. They haven't been able to pass anything because usually Russia or somebody uses that veto power. So nothing is getting done. And the international community at this point is getting frustrated. Us normal people as well, if we were to dive and look into it, do you think if this continues, it's going to get to the point where, it's going to be dissolved because nothing's coming out of it. Nothing's being done to prevent genocide. Nothing's being done to prevent what's going on in Syria. It's just nothing's being done. So what's the point?
It's a good question. And it's a good point. And it's actually usually the point we all talk about for like many classes after this. Usually I get stuck on these points because it is very important, because these vetoes can mean the difference of somebody living or dying. It really can. So let me give you a very good example. I'm kind of fast forwarding a little bit, But this picture you'll see down here is actually taken from a village in the country of Myanmar. And the population here is a Muslim minority. They're called the Rohingya population that have been there for many, 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 many years. In fact, most people even argue they've been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And you'll notice it may look, you can't maybe tell as well because it's a smaller picture, but when you guys look at the slides, you'll notice everything's burnt down like you would see like a forest fire here, right? That was done by actual troops and militias from the Myanmar government. They literally are burning down villages, pushing people out of the country. All these is creating this huge refugee crisis. The ones that do survive the attacks and these burning their villages and stuff and their livelihoods and their, these are people who've been there for, in some cases, they're burning homes that have been there for, more than at least 100 years. And so they're running these people out. What are they running across to? Bangladesh, and trying to get protection there. But now they're living literally on the edge of really environmental catastrophe because Bangladesh has regular floods. It's a much longer conversation there, which we will talk about last week. So I'm not trying to give you a short shrift there. And Karen, you're going to be in my class, in the geography class in a few weeks, and we're going to talk very much about genocide. So you guys get double dose if you're taking Dr. Pytel's in my class this term in this class, because we will come back to talk about the UN Security Council in that class. But yeah, there's definitely been deadlock. And in fact, what's interesting is generally this has been around the idea in the last couple of years that China and Russia generally veto anything that has to do with what they believe is interference in state sovereignty. Now, let's also be clear. It's also because they have economic relationships with these people as well. So there's real politics as well. So in the case of Russia, you'll notice the Syrians are still being massacred by their own government. Still, it's been going on for more than a few years now. Massive, massive refugee problems, massive deaths, men, women, and children. I mean, atrocities you can't even imagine. And yet, the Security Council has done almost nothing on it. Why? Because the Russian Federation has an alliance with the Assad regime who runs the country. And so every time a resolution comes up to sanction Syria, use peacekeepers there, whatever the case may be, authorize the use of force, basically it gets vetoed by the Russian Federation. In the case of Myanmar and what we just talked about, the People's Republic of China, what I have acronym here is PRC, that's their official name at the UN, is China's name is People's Republic of China. They are major allies with the Myanmar government. They have a trade relationship. So are they going to let anything come up that sanctions them or calls for investigations because of the genocide? No. And so Sudan and China, yeah, as Simi was just talking about, there's so many of these relationships. I'll show you actually the veto here, kind of count here in a minute, but it's an important point that Karen brings up because it literally people are dying because of the lack of political will. And a lot of it has to do with economics, a variety of other things. The problem is sometimes the votes don't even get that far in the Security Council because often the P5, just by them indicating when they're working on a working paper, like a draft resolution, that they're going to possibly veto it, it never even gets to a point of a vote. It just dies right there as an idea. So, this is where you have to ask, is the UN itself, what the founders of the UN, did they set it up to fail from the beginning by creating this structure? And that's not really for me to answer. It's really for something you to think a little bit about. But do remember that it's not just about the veto votes. Sometimes it is just simply a non-permanent member standing up for what they believe is right. So let me give you a good example of this. So in 1990, as probably some of you know, hopefully most of you know, Florida asked about, does the veto power for procedural votes? Veto vote doesn't only works on substantive votes. So procedurally, this is where the E10 have a lot of power. Because what they can do is they can hold up stuff. So if the P5 said, yeah, we want to do this thing, and the members of the non-permanent members go, nope, we're not going to let it come up for a vote, they can use the procedural votes to actually stop it from happening. Now, obviously, it doesn't happen very often. Okay, but yeah, the P5 veto vote is a substantive vote on resolutions, not on procedure. So that's a very good question. So 1990, short version, because we're coming close to the end of class here, is 1990, Saddam Hussein's invades Kuwait. This is where we got Operation Desert Shield in the U.S. context. And what happened was in January of 1991, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, who, by the way, had been the U.S. ambassador at one point to the UN, so he was a very seasoned diplomat, as well as being the former vice president. They went to the UN Security Council asking for authorization of force against Saddam Hussein, which it was authorized. By the way, that's important too, because it's actually that resolutions and subsequent resolutions that was pointed to when we invaded Iraq in 2003. So there's a lot of history involved here. But in 1991, the UN Security Council takes up this resolution. So when they take up the resolution, everybody votes in favor of it, including the P5, which was crazy. Mostly, by the way, because the people probably who would have vetoed it was the Russian Federation. But what's happening in 1991 globally? Does anybody remember?
Fall of the Soviet Union?
Fall of the Soviet Union. So the Russian Federation had not really, it had been founded, but it was sort of still kind of being pieced together. And the Soviet Union couldn't actually hold the seat at the Security Council. So they didn't vote. They weren't there. This is why I always say, if you're not in the room, you don't have a voice. There's great examples from world history of this. Because most likely Russia would have vetoed that resolution, most likely. So in 1991, you have this call for the use of authorization of force, which we'll talk more about next Wednesday, to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and parts of Saudi Arabia. 2 members voted against him, non-permanent members. One of them was Cuba, who was on the Security Council that year. Well, that's because it was a screw you to the United States, because relations between Cuba and particularly 1991, Castro was still alive. So let's just say Cuba always voted against anything the U.S. wanted. And the little country of Yemen, which I actually have lived in for a year. I was there in 1990. I was there actually turn of the millennium, actually. So I was there in 99 and 2000 and worked with the Yemeni government. And so I will tell you what the impact of it was. They voted. Now, mind you, they had the votes. So that vote by Yemen and Cuba didn't matter. They had the votes. It was a done deal. The U.S. ambassador, or one of the U.S. ambassadors, it said, turned to the Yemeni ambassador and said, that will be the costliest vote you ever cast in this body. Overnight, Yemen, about something on the order of, it's estimated about 3 to 4 million of their population of 13, so a small population, worked in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, these countries, as expatriate workers in the oil fields. Overnight, Saudi Arabia and other allies of the U.S. took away their visas, and they had to go home. So now you're taking all these Yemenis, throwing them back into their country with no jobs, 3 million people. What do you think happened to the economy of Yemen? Tanked. Yeah, it totally tanked. So in 1990, it was 1 U.S. rial, 1 Yemeni rial. Rial is the name of the currency there, or at least it was then. Now it's civil war time there, so it's a different issue. But 1 Yemeni rial to 1 U.S. dollar. So they weren't rich, but they were doing well. They were kind of growing economically. The ports there also, they had a relationship with the United States. It was not great times for Yemen, but it was good times. I went there in 1999 to work, and it was 166 Yemeni rials to 1 U.S. dollar. And that was actually good times. Their economy had tanked. So what you're seeing now, the catastrophe in Yemen, with the civil war, with cholera breakout, all the stuff, just Google Yemen. It's a disaster there right now. I can tell you, having lived there, and I speak Yemeni Arabic, that's the second language I speak, is Yemeni colloquial Arabic, is the nicest people on the face of the earth, but because they cast this one vote. And do you know why they cast that vote? It's not because they hated the United States. Their argument was, under Islamic law, and it's true, under Islamic law, there's a thing called CR, which is Arabic for international relationships between Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries. And they basically said, if there is a problem between 2 Muslim countries, it is the job of those Muslim countries to work it out first. And if they can't, then you bring in a good office or an outside body, and which could be a non-Muslim country. And that's also very true of Arab culture as well. So here, culturally, religiously, they thought they were doing the right thing, and it killed their entire economy. U.S. Peace Corps was there at the time, got pulled out. My former boss was their associate director, and overnight he lost his job. By the way, that's important for a variety of reasons, one of which is it is shortly after that tanking of their economy that Al-Qaeda and now ISIS started to grow in that country. If any of you guys have ever heard of the name John Walker Lind, he was the American Taliban that was caught on the fields right after 9/11 in Afghanistan. He actually came from the United States, went to Yemen, to a place called the Yemen Language Center to study Arabic as a expatriate, and didn't like it because he felt it was too non-religious. He then ends up going to a more religious center in other part of the country, and that's how he ended up being sucked into Al-Qaeda and into Afghanistan. I know that because I met John Walker Lind when I was there in 1999. And ironically, when he was finally convicted and brought back to the United States, he spent some time up in the high desert at the federal penitentiary up there, the transition center, while I was teaching at Victor Valley College. So the world is a weird time, let me tell you. But this all started because of one vote that didn't even really matter at the end of the day. Okay. So the last thing, and then we'll stop there, is do remember, as I said before, sometimes as the book talks about, there's this sort of what we call sixth veto, because the veto power only works for substantive votes, but the other 10 can hold up things procedurally. Because just like the General Assembly, all the votes in the Security Council have to pass by majority. So that means you have to have some of those other 10 for a procedure to occur, for a vote to be taken, for a variety of other things to occur. Okay, we're going to stop there. Does anybody have any questions? Where am I at? Whoops.
I did have one in particular. Earlier you said that the UN donates forces to be peacekeepers. However, and I asked you this during the General Assembly lecture, but obviously it was off topic. I understand that NATO is a separate entity technically from the UN. However, how does that explain then the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, which, while being part of NATO, it technically operates, from my understanding, under the auspices of the Security Council?
So remind me, because we're going to talk actually that, in fact, I have it on my slides for next week. So the short answer is CME, and then we'll talk more in depth about it next week, because it's a really good example of the partnership between like NATO and the Security Council, is that the UN Security Council can authorize peacekeepers, but they can also authorize what we call multinational forces, MNFs. And multinational forces are basically not actual UN peacekeepers, they're not blue helmets. Instead, what they are is they are usually a coalition of other countries who say, we're going to take care of this issue. Sometimes that coalition, by the way, can be a grouping of countries, like in the case of NATO. So NATO sends over its forces to take care of this issue. They go before the UN Security Council and they say, we would like to, because they can take action if they want to as a body, but usually they'll go to the Security Council and say, we'd like to get authorization to use force. And so that's what you're seeing in Afghanistan. As well as you saw it in the Balkans, by the way. There as well is this sort of partnership, so to speak, between NATO and the UN. Because you still have peacekeepers, by the way, in the case of Afghanistan, and you have peacekeepers, you have blue helmets in Afghanistan, you have them in Syria, you have them in Iraq. They are a smaller contingent, though, because of kind of how those things developed over time. But remind me, because we'll talk more in depth kind of how that played out as well. But it's a really good question, because it kind of shows this interesting relationship that occurs between intergovernmental organizations. And there's also kind of, barriers to that as well, which we'll talk about next week in depth.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? We wrap up here.
Was it Pacific Movement or Pacific Settlement, which you were talking about earlier?
Pacific Settlement is the term I use. So Pacific Movement would just be a movement that believes in pacifism or the settlement of violence. So it's using the same word. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good
Thank
question.
you.
The comments like addition.
Okay. Give me 1 second. Let me talk about one thing real quickly. So remember tomorrow, online module prep quiz number 3 open at 6 a.m. So don't forget about that. It's all on the Security Council. I will definitely be posting more videos for you between now and next week when I see you, including some that I've recorded, because we didn't get to everything tonight. So I'll probably just record that portion and make it into a little mini lecture and go more in depth to a couple things you guys have asked me. And then remember, next week we have real life application exercise number 3. I'll remind you of that next week. And of course, I'll see you here next week for the the end of this month for one of the last sessions. The last session we'll have in September at least for our live virtual session. Marcos, I'll let you have the last word, sir.
Oh, no, so there was a question in the chat.
Oh, was there? Okay. Let me see. We'll see.
Can any of the permanent members block the selections of the Security General?
Oh, it's a good. Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. They can technically, yes, per the charter, the UN Security, when they're voting on Secretary Generals, the P5 can veto it because it is a substantive vote. And has there been that before? Yeah, there have actually been people when Kofi Annan was, before he became the Secretary General of the United Nations, there was, I remember, a very tense moment that the United States possibly was going to veto his selection because he previously had been the head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the United Nations in 1994 when the Rwandan genocide happened. And so there's this question of like, do you want the Secretary General who was in charge of peacekeepers who allowed this genocide to occur on his watch? There was a lot of those kind of questions. Kofi Annan, of course, went on to serve 2 terms as Secretary General and was amazing. I always recommend, he died just not too long ago, actually. But the book he wrote right before he passed away was kind of his biography. Is really interesting. And he even talks a lot about that his greatest failure in life was the Rwandan genocide, not even a question. That he let politics and the procedure of the UN override what we should have been doing to solve those kind of conflicts there. Yeah. But usually I will say Secretary General is being voted on. By the time they get voted on at the Security Council, it's usually not a big controversial thing. A couple exceptions in history of the UN, but not very often. But yeah, they could be vetoed. Thank you, by the way, Marcus, for reminding me of that. I looked at all the others. I didn't see that one. So,
What's the book you mentioned?
I will send you the name of it. It's on my Kindle, which is still open right now. So we're have to watch you guys. So I have my tablet open so I can see what you guys are seeing as well from this side. So okay, I'll stick around for a couple minutes if people have questions. But otherwise, you guys have a great week. It's going to be hot this weekend, so don't go out there and get burnt or anything. We're not all going anywhere anyway. But you guys have a good weekend. If you have anything come up, let me know. Remember, quiz number 3 opens tomorrow morning.